How are we today? Don't you love it when the sun shines in winter? What a beautiful day it is. All right. This morning, I would like to talk to you about a centurion who had a sick servant. But before we read the passage in Matthew, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a centurion and what does it take to become a centurion. Now, if I ask most of you what is a centurion, most of you would be able to give me some sort of an answer. You would probably say that it's a Roman soldier in charge of about 100 men. Could be slightly more, could be slightly less. And you'd be right. That is true. That's exactly what a centurion is. But I doubt that most of you have really had a good look into what does it take to become a centurion. What is required? You see, the criteria to become a centurion is not particularly easy. Being of noble birth, having family connections, wealth, fame, none of that are part of the criteria. Centurions were not born with a silver spoon in their back pocket. A centurion, before he becomes a centurion, is a battle-hardened soldier. That's the very first step. On top of that, he needs to be big, tall, physically very strong. So much so that even his presence commands respect. On top of that, a centurion needs to be able to fight. His skills in hand-to-hand combat, his skills with a sword and a spear, a shield, they pretty much need to be second to none. On top of that, they need to be highly intelligent. Not just street smarts, they need to have book smarts. They need to be very clever people. The obvious where it starts is they need to be able to read and write. Now, we might think that's a bit odd, but back in that day, they would need to be able to do that. Now, a centurion is to lead his men into battle. So not only does he have to know which battles to pick and which ones not to, but he has to know the when, the where and the how. How is he going to attack? Exactly when. He has to get this strategy right. Now, sometimes he'd have quite some time. He'd be able to plan. But there'd be times when he has to make those decisions, not just for himself, but for his 100 men. He'd have to make that decision on the spur of the moment. He'd have seconds to work that out. And he needs to be able to get that right. Because if he gets it wrong, it's not only his life on the line, it's the 100 men that he's going into battle with. That is all on the line. Now, when I say he's going to lead his men into battle, not only is he going to be right in the middle of the fight with them, he's most likely going to throw the first punch on the way in. This is the sort of men they were. One such brave centurion whose name, there's just no way that I can pronounce it correctly, so it is what it is. Sempronius Densus. Like I say, it is what it is. This guy was in the Praetorians' Guard. Now, their job was to protect the emperor and his heir. Now, this particular guy was assigned to the heir. Now, there had been a bit of political turmoil. Surprise, surprise. Still happens now. And I did look up what the turmoil was, and to be honest, I can't explain it quickly. So I'm just going to say there's political turmoil. Now, the people that were upset the most with the emperor were the soldiers, the guards, and the centurions. I wouldn't have thought it'd been real smart to upset them. But anyway, that's what happened. They were so upset that they decided to assassinate the emperor and his heir. Now, if your guards decide to assassinate you, what hope have you got? That's what they tried. Now, on January the 15th, year 69, quite some time ago, the air was being transported through the streets, and it said that a band of assassins attacked. Now, the centurion that was there, he knew it was coming. He was one of the guards. Now, it's written that all the guards abandoned the air. They either fled or they swapped sides and attacked, except for one guy. This guy is Sempronius, however you pronounce it. He stood. Apparently he gave a warning as he drew his sword. He already had himself positioned in the right spot, close to the air. It's said that he stood his ground for quite some time. It doesn't give an exact time. It said that he stood his ground for quite some time with wave after wave of assassins. Now, these guys aren't just throwing insults online. They're coming at him with swords. So I would imagine that after a while, or after quite some time, you've got a pile of bodies surrounding you. And this guy took them all down. Until eventually, one of them got him below the knees, in which case he fell. And at that point, the assassination attempt was realised, the heir was killed, and so was this centurion. Another centurion, whose name I still can't pronounce, Lucius Cicius Dentatus. It said that he participated in at least 120 battles and 8 recorded individual duels. Now, most of those would have ended up with one person on the ground. That person wasn't going to get up again. 120 battles. Now, as we know, the Roman Empire spread far and wide, and they took cities and towns and things from places and peoples that didn't belong to them. And at one particular point, a city was reclaimed. Now, the emperor wasn't very impressed with that, and he got hold of this guy and he said, "Go and take that city back." And this centurion, Lucius, however you pronounce his name, Lucius, he told the emperor that this was a suicide mission and he didn't think he could do it. But he went anyway. I doubt that he had the option. So off he goes with his men. On the way, he gets to thinking. And he devised a plan where he actually fooled the enemy into thinking that they'd been overrun and they fled the city. At that point, he took the city and gained the advantage. What a clever guy. The reward that this man received for his intelligence, his bravery, was 45 scars. That was his reward. You can just see the people lining up for that, can't you? I guess after all that, 120 battles, you'd just be thankful that you were still alive. And I think it's suffice to say, you don't pick a fight with a centurion. You'd have to be a complete moron. This is the type of people that they were, the type of courage and the type of intelligence that you needed to possess to become a centurion. It's not surprising that some commentators suggest that centurions were the backbone of the Roman army. Some of them went as far to say that they were the backbone of the entire Roman Empire, such as was the respect that people had for them. We also know there's a centurion mentioned in the book of Matthew. Now, this centurion, along with his men, had the job of keeping the town of Capernaum safe. And in turn, this part of the Roman Empire secure. It appears that he's won the favour of the people. He's respected by the elders, clearly a man of means because he built them a synagogue, which some commentators suggest that he had an appreciation and some knowledge of the God that the Jews served. Now, to my knowledge, it wasn't common for the Romans to build synagogues for the Jews. But this man had recognised that when the Jews were encouraged to worship their God, seek their Lord, spend time in prayer, study the scriptures, they actually became nicer people. It was written that there were less uprisings. There could be a few politicians out there today that could take a leaf out of his book. There was less violence on the streets. The people became peaceful. They became happy and content. Now, if there's less trouble on the streets from that, you'd have to say that was a win-win for everybody, especially for the man that was charged with keeping them in line. Now, let's take a little look at Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through to 13, and we'll start with verses 5 and 6. Sorry, these things are a bit of a necessity these days. Verses 5 and 6, chapter 8. So when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, "Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, dreadfully tormented." So Jesus has entered Capernaum in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. Capernaum's a town on the northern shores of the Sea of Galilee. In the first century, it's a commercial and a social hub. Jesus also used this town as his base during his ministry. And some people suggest that it actually became his hometown. Now, it was in Capernaum here that Jesus met some fishermen, James, John, Peter, and Andrew. Also a tax collector by the name of Matthew. And I'm sure you're all aware that these people became his disciples. Now the centurion comes up to him and pleads with him, saying, "My servant is lying at home, paralyzed, dreadfully tormented." Now we know from the Gospel of Luke that the centurion himself didn't actually go, that he sent some messengers. And in the custom of the day, that was perfectly acceptable. The messenger's word was taken as true and accurate, and it carried the weight of the centurion that actually sent them. These messengers, as it happened, were some elders from the local synagogue. The centurion had made the assumption that because these guys were religious leaders, that they would know how to approach Jesus and best convince him to heal the servant. And approach Jesus they did. And they reasoned with him, saying that the centurion was a worthy man and that he was deserving of Jesus' attention and that he loved the Jews and that he'd even built them a synagogue. All right, let's take a look at verses 7, 8 and 9. And Jesus said to him, "I will come and heal him." The centurion answered and said, "Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it." Now, I find it interesting that everybody thinks this centurion is a worthy man, except for the centurion himself. He's obviously very talented and very capable, otherwise he wouldn't have been a centurion. He's also a very respected man. He also knows that standing next to Jesus, he's got nothing to offer. He brings nothing to the table. See, this centurion, being part of his job, he would have had eyes and ears everywhere throughout this entire region. He knew what was going on with everybody. That's his job. So he already knows what Jesus can do. He also knows how the chain of command works. If he tells the men under him to jump, they will jump. If the people above him tell him to jump, he's going to jump. And in light of that, the centurion has already deduced that If Jesus can just speak a word and sickness and diseases leave somebody just by speaking a word, then he's no ordinary man. That's not normal. And the centurion has worked out that this man has authority over nature itself. And that would either make him the creator or the messenger of the creator. Either way, he has the authority of the creator. Now, it's interesting that the Jewish elders made the assumption that to approach Jesus and receive some sort of blessing, that you'd have to be worthy. You'd have to have done some sort of works of righteousness. Now, we know that the elders and the Pharisees of the day, this is how they thought. We know that that's not quite right. It's not that it's not quite right, it's not right at all. We know that's not how it works, but how often do we fall into the trap, that same trap, of thinking that we're not good enough to come to Jesus? How often do we fall into that trap? That we're not good enough to come to Jesus and or receive a blessing. Are we good enough to come before Jesus? There's a question. Are we good enough to come before Jesus? Let me rephrase it. Do we need to be good enough to come before Jesus? I can see on the faces of some of you, you appreciate the fact that I've rephrased that question and you're agreeing with me. No, of course not. But you know, I don't like the line of question. I don't like the way that all that is worded. I think we waste our time thinking about, are we good enough? Do we have to be good enough? It sends us on that train of thought of what have I done? Instead, I think we probably should spend our time just praising him for his grace and his mercy. Thank him for his grace and mercy and dwell on that. We can come to him just as we are. Verse 10 says, when Jesus heard it, he marvelled and said to those who followed, assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. Ouch. To the elders that were standing there, to the Pharisees of the day. What did the centurion come to Jesus with? What did he bring to the table? Nothing. Nothing other than his faith. I suggest there was a bit of humility in there as well. But he came with nothing other than faith. I'm going to tell you a little story now, and I'm pretty sure, well, I know I've told this story as a children's story, and I think I may have even told it twice. But it fits in with this so well that I'm going to tell it again. Quite a few years ago, when the young fella sitting over here was quite a bit shorter, he might have been 5 or 6 years old, he was wandering around the house singing. Now, he was just singing some little songs that he'd learnt in Sabbath school. And he'd have a line out of this song and a line out of that song and a chorus out of that one and another chorus from over here. And sometimes he'd repeat the songs and the choruses, and the songs were all mixed up. But he was enjoying himself, and he was wandering about the house singing away to his heart's content with a big smile on his face. And after about 5 minutes, he comes running up to me. He says, Daddy, did you like the song I made? I said, mate, I absolutely loved it. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. And he's smiling at me. And I said, you know, there's someone else that listened to that song and they loved it as well. And he looks at me with a frown, and he looks around the house. He knew that Katrina was out. It was just the two of us there. And he looks back at me with his little frown. He says, who? I said, mate, when little boys and girls sing like that, Jesus loves it. It does something for him. It warms his heart. And I can guarantee you right now that Jesus is looking right at you with a big smile on his face. And little Zeke's face lit up, and he flew over to the window and he looked straight up in the air and he waves like this. And I thought, wow, he believed me. He believed what I said, that Jesus was actually looking at him, smiling and so he ran to the window, and his actions proved his faith. His actions proved it. Here we have a Roman centurion raised in a pagan empire that is showing this similar faith in Jesus. His words and his actions have proved it. And that's probably what made Jesus marvel the way he did. Verses 11 and 12. And I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That continues on with the ouch to the local elders and the Pharisees of the day. You know, it's said that when Jesus marvelled, that he actually looked down through time and it warmed his heart to see Gentiles, people from every nation, people from all walks of life, to see them hear the gospel and turn their hearts and their minds towards him. It warmed his heart. And then as he looked back at the Jews that were standing around him, probably caused a little bit of confliction with his emotions, and it probably prompted the next words that came out. See, the Jews, maybe not all of them, but quite a few of them, they thought that they had some sort of rights to the kingdom simply because they were Jews. And sadly, some Seventh-day Adventists over the years have thought that they've had rights to the kingdom simply because they were Adventists. Now, don't get me wrong. I think it's a special thing to be an Adventist. I am one. I think we have a message and I think we have a mission. Verse 13. Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go your way, and as you have believed, so let it be done for you." And we know that his servant was healed at that point. The more I read that text over the last month, the more troubled I became. You see, in my mind, there's only one way I can interpret that, and it's like this. But as we now, each one of us, go our own way, we can rest in this assurance with 100% certainty that it will be done for us to the exact measure of our own faith. Well, I think that's worth thinking about for a bit. You see, Ephesians chapter 2 verse 8 says that we are saved by grace through faith. Saved by grace through faith. Now we know that Jesus has an absolute abundance of grace. No one's going to argue with that. No one's going to question that. But there was two elements to it, wasn't there? Which leaves a question about faith. My question to you is, how's your faith? Could you say that you have faith like the centurion? Could you say that, in all honesty? I can't pass judgment as to whether you do or you don't. I can only pass a judgment on myself. And I would have to say, I don't know that I could, if I was totally honest. Do I have that kind of faith? I think that'd challenge me, very much so. And like I say, I can't talk about your faith, so I'll mention quickly something about mine. About 12 months ago, Pastor Mark here asked me to stand up and preach for the divine service. That was his words. Can you preach for the divine service? I thought, you could have chosen some different words. And I thought to myself, Mark, there's a reason you haven't seen me standing at that pulpit. said, "You've got to be joking. I don't possess a single skill that is required to stand up here and preach. To start with, you've got to prepare a sermon. You have to understand the scriptures to some point. But you've got to prepare something. You're all looking at me expecting me to say something, and you have to be prepared to say something." I didn't know how to go about that. No idea. That's just the first part. The next bit, you've actually got to stand up here and present it. Well, I don't know how many of you remember what happened 12 months ago. I was so nervous, I was beside myself. And when I walked out the back, and it's a shame Tilly's not sitting here because I'm pretty sure it was her. As I walked into the back room, she looked at me and she said, "Are you okay?" And I looked back and I thought, someone's asked, so I'm going to tell her. And I said, "Tilly, I'm not sure if I'm going to cry or vomit." She said to me, "Please choose the crying option. There's far less mess to clean up." Fair enough. But I was extremely nervous. But I stood up here. I did the best I could. And in the end, I walked off down that corridor and out the door. And as I got towards the end of the corridor down there, Tony, who's sitting down there in that seat, he leans across and he goes, "You nailed it." And I probably got a step or two in before my brain registered what he'd said. And I remember turning around and going, "Oh, what? How could that be?" Well, it wasn't too many more steps before I was out the door. The first person that came out to me was Tony. And he came up to me and he shook my hand and he goes, "That was great, you absolutely nailed it." And I looked at him, I said, "You've got to be kidding." I was so nervous, I felt like I was going to collapse. And he said, "I had no idea that you were nervous. You didn't look nervous, it didn't show at all." I thought, come on now. And then I realised at that point, God must have had my back, because I know how I felt. And Tony's telling me what he saw and what it looked like from where he was sitting. I thought, well, God had to have my back. There is no other option. There's no other conclusion for it. I don't possess the skills to do what Mark had asked me to do. I'm not Mark. I'm not Dwayne. I'm not Gav. I'm not any of you. But I stood up and I had to go. And I realised at that point, this is the type of thing that builds my faith. Tony's words helped to build my faith at that point. And I know that seems like a small thing, but I'm sure there's many of you sitting here that can think back through your life and come up with a whole pile of little things where you know God has helped you, where you know that God has had your back. I'd like to challenge you to think about these things. Remember them. Write them down. Put them in a book, whatever it takes, but think about them and dwell on them. Remember what God has done for you in the past and let them strengthen your faith. When the opportunity arises, whatever it is, say yes. Put yourself out there and then pray and fast and pray some more, fast some more. And if you're anything like me, you've got to pray some more and fast some more. And then when the time comes, step up and let God shine, because he has got your back. Thank you.